In war, information can be more powerful than weapons. During the Second World War, both sides quickly realized that knowing the enemy's plans, movements, and weaknesses could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Intelligence became a silent battlefield, one where secrets, not bullets, decided outcomes. But while many imagined spies in dark alleys or brutal interrogations in hidden rooms, the British had a very different idea. An idea so simple, so subtle, that it almost seemed ridiculous. Captured German pilots were among the most valuable sources of information in the entire war. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were trained officers, trusted with critical missions, aware of flight routes, squadron strengths, radio frequencies, and operational tactics. Each one carried a piece of the Luftwaffe's puzzle. Naturally, the Germans trained them to resist interrogation at all costs. They were taught how to stay silent, how to mislead, and how to endure questioning without revealing anything important. Many believed they were completely prepared. But the British were not interested in forcing answers out of them. Instead, they created a place that didn't feel like a prison at all. Hidden in the English countryside stood a grand estate known as Trent Park. From the outside, it looked more like a noble residence than a wartime facility, a large country house surrounded by greenery, quiet, and distance from the chaos of war. When captured German officers arrived there, what they found was unexpected. There were no harsh cells, no chains, no visible threats. Instead, they were given comfortable rooms, proper beds, good food, and even access to a kind of social life. To many of them, it felt civilized. This was the illusion. The British understood something crucial about human behavior. People are far more likely to reveal secrets when they feel safe than when they feel threatened. Fear creates resistance. Comfort creates openness. So instead of breaking prisoners down, they built them up, giving them just enough freedom to believe they were no longer in danger. The officers talked, they laughed, they relaxed, and most importantly, they forgot. They forgot that they were still in enemy hands. They forgot their training. They forgot that every word they spoke could still matter. Sitting in armchairs, sharing drinks, or casually discussing their experiences with fellow prisoners, they began to speak freely, not because they were forced to, but because it felt natural. What they didn't know was that Trent Park was not just a comfortable house, it was a carefully designed trap. Behind the elegant walls, hidden deep within the structure, were microphones, placed in rooms, in common areas, even where conversations seemed most private. The officers were never told. There were no signs, no hints, nothing to suggest they were being listened to. To them, these were just ordinary discussions between comrades, far from the front lines. But on the other side of those walls, British intelligence officers were listening to everything. Every casual remark, every boast, every complaint, every detail. What made this operation so effective was not just the technology, but the environment. The prisoners believed they were speaking among equals. There was no interrogator in front of them, no pressure, no reason to lie or hold back. In fact, many of them wanted to talk, to share stories, to impress others, to process what they had been through. And in doing so, they revealed far more than they ever would under questioning. Some spoke about missions they had flown, others discussed tactics, formations, and new weapons. Sometimes they mentioned specific locations, names of commanders, or even operational weaknesses, things that could be incredibly valuable to the Allies. These weren't forced confessions, they were unguarded conversations. That was the genius of it. The British didn't need to break the prisoners, they simply needed to let them be themselves. Trent Park became a place where the most disciplined officers in the German military unknowingly exposed secrets they had sworn to protect, not through pain, not through fear, but through comfort, routine, and the simple human desire to talk. It was a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapon was trust and the trap was invisible. And as the war continued, the information gathered from this quiet country house would prove to be far more powerful than anyone inside it could imagine. What made the operation at Trent Park truly extraordinary was not just the hidden microphones or the elegant surroundings. It was the simplicity of the method used to unlock even the most guarded minds. There was no elaborate interrogation strategy, no visible manipulation. Instead, it often began with something as ordinary as a drink. Beer, in particular, played a surprisingly important role. For many of the captured German officers, being offered a drink felt like a return to normal life. It reminded them of home, of mess halls, of evenings spent with fellow pilots after missions. It lowered their guard in a way no interrogation ever could. The British understood this perfectly. A relaxed man with a drink in his hand is far more likely to speak freely than one sitting under a spotlight facing questions. So they created an environment where conversations felt natural, almost inevitable. Groups of officers would gather, sometimes after meals, sometimes in the evenings, sitting together in comfortable rooms. There was no one forcing them to talk. In fact, there was no one guiding the conversation at all. That was the brilliance of it. The discussions unfolded on their own, driven by ego, curiosity, and the need to share experiences. And these were not just casual chats. Many of these men were highly skilled pilots, proud of their missions, eager to prove themselves even in captivity. They talked about dogfights, about victories, about the aircraft they flew and the strategies they used. They compared notes, debated tactics, and sometimes even argued over who had the better approach in combat. Without realizing it, they were revealing patterns. One officer might mention a specific route used during a bombing run. Another might casually refer to radio communication issues. Someone else might talk about how certain squadrons were being deployed or rotated. Each piece on its own might seem insignificant, but together they formed a clear picture, one that British intelligence was carefully assembling in real time. What made this even more effective was the presence of other prisoners. The Germans believed they were among their own. They had no reason to suspect that their conversations were anything but private. In fact, being surrounded by fellow officers often encouraged them to speak more openly. There was a sense of shared identity, even camaraderie. They were not talking to the enemy, or so they thought. This created a dangerous illusion, because in that environment, silence felt unnecessary. There was no pressure to remain guarded. No one was asking direct questions. No one was taking notes in front of them. The absence of obvious surveillance made the situation feel safe, even comfortable. And that's when the most valuable information surfaced. Sometimes it came out in the form of boasting. A pilot describing a successful mission might reveal details about altitude, timing, or defensive weaknesses he had exploited. Other times it came out through frustration, complaints about leadership decisions, faulty equipment, or changing strategies. These emotional moments often led to even more revealing statements as the officers spoke without filtering themselves. Alcohol only amplified this effect. Even a small amount was enough to loosen discipline. The careful training that had once guided their behavior began to fade into the background. Conversations became more animated, more detailed, more honest. The line between what should be said and what should remain secret slowly disappeared. And still, none of them suspected a thing. They believed they were simply passing time, making the best of an unfortunate situation. Some even began to enjoy their surroundings, seeing Trent Park less as a prison and more as a temporary retreat. The very conditions designed to make them comfortable were the same conditions that made them vulnerable. It was a perfect psychological trap, because the British didn't need them to trick them into speaking. They simply created a space where speaking felt natural, where silence felt unnecessary, and where the idea of being monitored seemed impossible. By the time the officers returned to their rooms, the damage was already done. Every word had been captured, every detail preserved, and somewhere just beyond the walls they trusted, intelligence officers were turning those conversations into actionable insights that could shape the course of the war. All of it made possible not by force, but by something as simple as a drink and a conversation. Behind the calm conversations and quiet laughter at Trent Park, there was an entirely different world operating in complete silence, a world the German officers never saw, never suspected, and never even imagined could exist just a few inches beyond the walls they trusted. Because Trent Park was not just a comfortable estate, it was one of the most sophisticated listening operations of the entire war. Hidden within the structure of the building was a carefully installed network of microphones. They were placed in bedrooms, in common areas, even in spaces where privacy was assumed without question. The installation had been done with precision, wires running through walls, ceilings, and floors, all leading to secure rooms where the real work was taking place. Nothing about it was visible. There were no loose panels, no strange devices, no clues that could raise suspicion. The house looked and felt completely ordinary. That was essential. If even a single officer had begun to suspect they were being listened to, the entire operation could have collapsed overnight. But the illusion held. On the other side of those hidden microphones sat teams of British intelligence officers, listeners, translators, and analysts. Their job was not just to hear the conversations, but to understand them, capture them, and turn them into something useful. Many of the conversations were in German, often filled with slang, military jargon, or regional accents. It required skilled linguists who could follow every word in real time without missing meaning or context. They listened for hours. Every conversation was carefully monitored, often recorded or written down as it happened. The officers worked in shifts, ensuring that nothing was missed, not a casual remark, not a passing comment, even a joke that might contain a hidden detail. Because in this environment, even the smallest piece of information could be significant. And there was a lot to listen to. The German officers spoke about everything: their missions, their units, their frustrations, their victories. Sometimes the conversations were loud and animated. Other times they were quiet, almost whispered, but still captured clearly by the hidden system built into the walls. What made the operation so effective was consistency. Unlike traditional interrogation, which happens at specific moments under controlled conditions, this system worked all the time. Day or night, formal or informal, every word spoken within range could be heard. There was no need to decide when to question a prisoner, because the prisoners were constantly revealing information on their own. But listening was only the first step. Once the conversations were captured, they had to be processed. Intelligence officers would transcribe the recordings, translate them into English, and then analyze the content for anything valuable. Patterns began to emerge over time. Names would repeat. Locations would be mentioned more than once. Certain details, when cross-referenced with other sources, could confirm or reveal critical insights. This was not random eavesdropping. It was a structured intelligence system designed to turn human behavior into actionable data. Sometimes a single conversation could contain multiple layers of value. A pilot casually describing a mission might unknowingly confirm the existence of a new squadron. A complaint about equipment might hint at technical weaknesses. Even disagreements between officers could reveal differences in strategy or command structure. And because the information came from the officers themselves, voluntarily, without pressure, it was often more reliable than anything obtained through direct questioning. There was no need to filter out lies told under duress. These were genuine thoughts, shared freely among peers. That made them incredibly powerful. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the operation was how invisible it remained. The German officers lived their daily routines without ever realizing that their environment had been engineered against them. They spoke openly in rooms they believed were private, unaware that their voices were traveling through hidden wires into the hands of their enemy. It wasn't just surveillance, it was a complete reversal of control. The prisoners believed they were simply waiting out the war, maintaining their dignity, holding on to their secrets. But in reality, those secrets were slipping away piece by piece, carried by their own voices into a system designed to capture everything. And as the days turned into weeks and the conversations continued without interruption, the amount of intelligence gathered grew into something extraordinary, all without a single question being asked. By the time the operation at Trent Park was in full swing, British intelligence was no longer just listening, it was learning. What had started as scattered conversations between captured officers was now turning into a steady stream of usable, actionable intelligence, the kind that could influence decisions far beyond the quiet walls of the estate. Because once those voices were captured, they didn't stay in Trent Park. They were transformed. Transcripts were compiled, translated, and passed along to analysts who began connecting the dots. Individual remarks that once seemed trivial started to form patterns. A mention of a flight route here, a complaint about fuel shortages there, a casual reference to a new deployment somewhere else. When combined, they revealed a much larger picture of how the German Air Force was operating. And that picture was incredibly valuable. The Luftwaffe depended on coordination, timing, and precision. Knowing where squadrons were based, how often they rotated, or what tactics they preferred could give the Allies a critical advantage. Suddenly, missions that once relied on guesswork could be planned with far greater confidence. In some cases, intercepted conversations helped identify weaknesses. Pilots would talk about mechanical issues, unreliable equipment, or the limitations of certain aircraft under specific conditions. These weren't official reports, they were honest frustrations shared between officers who believed they were speaking in private. But to British intelligence, they were insights into vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Other times, the information was even more direct. There were moments when officers discussed specific operations they had taken part in, describing targets, routes, and even defensive strategies they had encountered. While they rarely intended to reveal sensitive details, the natural flow of conversation often led them further than they realized. A story told to impress others could end up exposing far more than intended. And then there were the unexpected revelations. Some conversations went beyond tactics and operations. They revealed attitudes, beliefs, and morale within the German military. Intelligence officers began to understand not just what the Luftwaffe was doing, but how its officers were thinking. Whether they were confident or uncertain, loyal or critical of their leadership, all of it mattered. Because war is not just fought with machines, it is fought with people. Understanding the mindset of the enemy could be just as important as knowing their movements. As more and more information flowed in, it began to influence real decisions. Allied planners could adjust strategies based on what they now knew. Air defenses could be strengthened in areas that were likely to be targeted. Offensive operations could be timed more effectively, taking advantage of gaps or weaknesses revealed through these conversations. In some cases, lives were saved. Pilots flying missions over enemy territory faced enormous risks, but when intelligence from Trent Park provided even a small advantage, a hint about enemy behavior, a clue about positioning, it could make the difference between success and disaster. The men speaking casually in that quiet English estate had no idea that their words were shaping outcomes far beyond their reach. And yet, the most remarkable part of it all was how effortless it seemed. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no single moment where everything changed. Instead, it was a slow accumulation, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, like assembling a puzzle without ever seeing the full image until it was nearly complete. The British didn't need one big secret. They gathered hundreds of small ones.
And together, those small pieces became a powerful intelligence advantage that the Germans never realized they had lost. Inside Trent Park, the officers continued their routines, talking, debating, remembering their missions. They believed they were holding on to their knowledge, preserving it as trained. But outside those walls, that knowledge was already being used, quietly, efficiently, and with consequences that would echo across the war.
In the end, what made Trent Park so effective was not just the technology or even the intelligence gathered from it. It was the simple fact that the entire operation remained invisible from beginning to end. The German officers never realized they had been part of one of the most successful intelligence traps of the war. Not during their captivity, not even after they left. These were not untrained men. They were disciplined, experienced officers, many of them taught to resist interrogation and to guard sensitive information with absolute care. They understood the risks of being captured. They expected pressure, questioning, even manipulation. But what they encountered at Trent Park didn't match any of those expectations. And that's exactly why it worked. There were no interrogators demanding answers, no threats, no signs of surveillance. Everything about the environment suggested the opposite, that they were safe, that they were being treated fairly, even respectfully. Over time, this created a powerful sense of normality. The longer they stayed, the more natural it all felt. And when something feels natural, it stops being questioned. That was the psychological core of the operation. The British didn't try to outsmart the prisoners in a direct confrontation. They simply removed the conditions that would make the prisoners cautious. Without pressure, there was no need for resistance. Without suspicion, there was no reason to stay silent. The officers weren't forced into mistakes. They drifted into them, slowly and unconsciously. Even their own training worked against them. They had been prepared for interrogation, for hostile environments, for obvious attempts to extract information, but they had not been trained to remain silent among their own comrades. They had not been taught to treat casual conversation as a potential threat, and they certainly had not imagined that the very walls around them could be listening. It was a blind spot, and the British built their entire strategy around it. What makes this story even more remarkable is how long it remained secret. For years after the war, many of the men who had been held at Trent Park never knew what had really happened there. They returned home believing they had kept their secrets, believing they had done their duty. But history would eventually reveal the truth. When the recordings and transcripts became known, it exposed just how much had been uncovered through this quiet operation. Conversations that once seemed harmless were now seen in a completely different light. Words spoken casually, even confidently, had carried consequences far beyond what anyone inside Trent Park could have imagined. And yet, there was no single moment of betrayal, no turning point where someone decided to give everything away. Instead, it was something far more subtle, a gradual unraveling of discipline through comfort, routine, and trust. A reminder that even the most prepared minds can be vulnerable under the right conditions. Trent Park changed the way intelligence could be gathered. It proved that information doesn't always need to be forced out. Sometimes it can be invited out, quietly, patiently, without the subject ever realizing it's happening. This approach would go on to influence modern intelligence methods, shaping how agencies think about human behavior, interrogation, and surveillance. Because at its core, this wasn't just a story about hidden microphones or clever tricks. It was a story about psychology, about how people behave when they feel safe, about how easily caution can fade when there is no obvious threat, and about how the most effective deceptions are often the ones that feel the most ordinary. In a war defined by destruction and conflict, Trent Park stood apart as something different, a place where the battle was fought without weapons, and where the greatest victories came not from force, but from understanding the human mind. The officers who walked its halls believed they had outlasted their enemies' attempts to break them. They never realized they had already told them everything.